Why are there gay people? In the public debate on the rights of LGBTQI+ people, we often hear various opinions. However, among the arguments, there's one from the conservative side that is usually discredited as homophobic and is never answered. This argument, which indeed sounds homophobic, is summarized in 3 simple strands. Being gay is biologically a productive disadvantage for the human species. Therefore, is not normal. So, society has no business to include in its structures an abnormal behavior. This specific argument seems to have a strong logical basis and indeed on one of the most important scientific discoveries of mankind, the theory of the evolution of species. But, is that really true? What the law of natural selection tells us is that the genetic characteristics of a species that reduce its chances of reproduction are eliminated with the passage of generations. Otherwise, the species itself is eliminated. Consequently, homosexuality, which by definition does not favor procreation, should have gradually disappeared. And yet, contrary to the law of natural selection, it still exists, and even without its frequency in the population showing signs of a decline for several thousand years. In this video, you will understand why are there homosexual people, and prepare to be surprised, because the answer is not only based on biology, but also on social anthropology and economics. So, let's turn to the theory of evolution. Most people think of the theory of evolution as the scientific hypothesis that man descended from apes. However, the theory of evolution describes a much more general mechanism of natural adaptation, which explains a multitude of phenomena in nature, society, economics, and even IT. The central logic of the theory is very simple. We have a species, in which some individual is at some point subject to a random mutation of some characteristic. If a mutation happens to give that individual some reproductive advantage, the mutant organism will gradually establish itself as an autonomous variety in nature, because each generation of it will pass its mutated genes to more and more offspring. It is also possible through the mixing of natural competition, that the original variety is completely replaced by the mutant. On the contrary, if the random mutation causes a reproductive disadvantage, the mutated organism will never be able to compete with the original one, and within a few generations the mutation will disappear, because its genes are simply not passed on to enough offspring. Let's look at an example. Here we have a dark female frog. Due to a random mutation, the female frog gives birth to a male frog that is surprisingly green. The new color gives the buzzard a predatory advantage, because it is more effectively camouflaged in the vegetation, and thus, catches more mosquitoes, so it feeds better than the other frogs. This can easily be turned into a reproductive advantage, as female frogs tend to want to mate with male frogs that are good hunters. The green color genes will therefore be passed on to the next generations, and at some point green may become the dominant color in the species. Conversely, if due to a random mutation the female frog gave birth to a purple phosphorescent male frog, that would be pretty cool, but it would be extremely difficult for that frog to hunt. Eventually, the female frogs would put him in the friend zone, and it would be very hard for him to pass his purple phosphorescent genes to the next generations, and, eventually, his cool color would slowly disappear from the kingdom of frogs. Darwin himself drew inspiration for the theory of evolution from the economic model of population growth developed by Thomas Robert Malthus 60 years earlier. In this model, Malthus had proved that economic resources are the most important factor in changing world population. In 1924, the leading geneticist and physiologist, Jack Haldane, introduced a more mathematically oriented approach to the theory of evolution, by proving quantitatively that natural kin selection was a fundamental mechanism of evolution. Half a century later, in 1975, a biologist named Edward Wilson linked Haldane's methodology to the speculation that the most reproductive value that homosexuality offered to humanity might not be primarily biological in nature, but rather pass through the channeling of the economic resources in society. Wilson's hypothesis remained a hypothesis until 2007, when a Canadian neuroscientist named Paul Vassie visited Samoa. During his journey, he met a not-so-modern society, with a strange social and cultural practice. While the rest of the world, at least until recently, officially recognized only 2 sexes, Samoans for centuries recognized at least 3. The women, the men, and the Fa'afafin. Fafafin are native male homosexuals who, in Western terminology, show some transgender elements. So while Vassi was trying to understand why this Samoan society was so receptive and friendly to the Fafafin, he realized that the presence of Fafafin was giving the population a significant reproductive advantage. The Fafafin themselves rarely had children, but channeled the financial resources they saved to their nieces and nephews, and this indirectly gave a reproductive advantage to families that had Fafafin members, compared to those that did not. But since nowhere in the literature has it been proven that it is mathematically possible, I created an economic model of population growth to see if it is really possible that homosexuality causes overbirth. Let's see. We have a society where each adult can allocate up to 70 units of resources to their children. So if we take a family with 3 straight adult siblings, each will mate with someone and each pair will be able to allocate up to 140 units of resources in total. Let me indicate that these resources are financial, but we don't necessarily talk about money. It can be food, shelter, housework, custody, education, protection, or anything else that helps a family to raise their children. So, for the sake of simplification, we quantify all these resources together in a network, a number that potentially describes a couple's financial ability to have children. If we now assume that 50 units of such resources are required to raise a child, each couple in the example will be able to have up to 2 children. That is, they will allocate only 100 of the 140 units of resources they can produce to procreation, and consequently, the extended family of 3 siblings can have a total of up to 6 children. So, we have a ratio of children per adult that is 6 to 6. But now, say that one of the 3 siblings, let's name him Sam, is gay. Sam can also allocate up to 70 units of resources, but his sexual orientation does not make it easy for him to have children. But because she is still an active member of her family and society has not marginalized him, he contributes his resources to the families of his 2 siblings. So the 2 couples now have access to resources that might last for 3 or even 4 children. The existence of Sam is that it allows this family to have up to 7 children, changing the ratio of children per adult from 6 to 6 to 5 to 7. If you haven't realized yet how dramatically this change in ratio affects population growth, look at the numbers. If the initial population in this society was 1,000 people, with 6 to 6 the population would remain constant, since 6 adults leave behind 6 children, who in turn will leave another 6, so each one leaves behind exactly 1 to replace him. However, if the ratio is 5 to 7, each person leaves behind 1.4 children, which means that in just 10 generations the population of 1,000 people will reach almost 29,000. It must be made clear that the presence of Fafafin does not create new resources, it simply distributes the existing ones with a greater economic efficiency, and this can also activate the couple's resources. For example, if Sam devoted 8 hours per day for his niece's babysitting, then he can give the opportunity to 2 people from his siblings' households to work outside the home. In other words, Fafafin's contribution is to supplement resources where they are missing, and thus makes a difference. In this way, the families that have Fafafin will continue to pass their genes to the next generations alongside the rest of the families. This may be an explanation for why today we observe a constant frequency of homosexuality in the population. In fact, similar social parameters in natural kin selection explain the existence of homosexuality in animals as well. A very extensive study of 1,500 mammal species has recently presented findings that homosexuality helps animals to maintain their social relations within the herd or swarm, by mitigating conflicts and improving overall reproductive potential in these species. Vassi's findings have also been confirmed by the findings of 2 other surveys in Canada and Java, Indonesia. Here, we must take into account 2 very important factors. First, no distribution of resources can take place if society marginalizes gay people. If we throw every gay child on the street because of their sexual preference, then what kind of distribution of resources can we expect to take place? Second, and equally important, the evolution of man to date did not take place in the last 50, 100, or 200 years. It has lasted for many millennia, so it has been created in social and anthropological structures completely different from the ones we experience around us today. In other words, if someone said not all gays today help their siblings, or today, gay people can also have children, it would not have mattered in how our species evolved. The model we developed also gives us some particularly interesting findings about how the frequency of gay people in the population affects fertility. If their frequency is very low, the reproductive advantage becomes negligible because there simply aren't enough homosexuals to distribute their resources. On the contrary, if the frequency of gay people is too high, the resources are there, but have nowhere to be distributed, because there are few straight people left to have children. In the model, for most parameter sets we tested, the percentage that lead to maximum population growth was typically between 4 and 18%. For example, with the parameters we used before and an initial population of 1,000 people, we can see how the population will evolve after 10 generations for each percentage of people that are gay. Homosexuality's presence rates of up to 28% lead to greater population growth than if there were no gays at all. Here, the maximum population is reached at a frequency of 14%, while the zone of reproductive decline starts at 28%, where if the frequency exceeds, homosexuality leads to a low fertility rate. It is important to emphasize that these frequencies derive from the model for the specific parameters we used. If we had the real values of the parameters for each true society, it would emerge with a similar shape with the same regions but possibly with numerically different frequency limits. It is important to keep in mind that both Haltian and Vassi, and the other scientists who have contributed to the theory of natural kin selection, present it as one of the mechanisms and not as the sole explanation of homosexuality. Species evolutions, reproduction and nature itself follow complex and multifactorial patterns, where everything can happen for more than one reason and in more than one way. This is why science and research never end. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to subscribe.